While we prepare to hear this matter, I kindly ask you to support the channel by subscribing, giving a like, and mentioning in the comments where you're tuning in from.
I remember that morning because nothing about it was supposed to be memorable. The docket was long: parking tickets, missed inspections, paperwork mistakes, ordinary problems brought in by ordinary people. I was in the rhythm that comes from decades on the bench. Listen, weigh, decide, move on. The clerk's voice carried names the way it always does, steady and unadorned, until he paused for a breath and said, clearly, Hunter Biden. I didn't react, not because the name meant nothing, but because in a courtroom it has to mean the same as every other. I'd heard it 1,000 times on television. In that room, it landed like any other sound: ink on paper, shoes on tile. I waited a beat, the way I always do, letting the room settle into the truth that a case doesn't arrive with headlines attached. He walked in wearing a tailored suit, well cut, well worn. Expensive, yes, but not loud. His shoulders were set, not stiff, not relaxed, either like a man trying to hold himself still. He didn't scan the gallery. He didn't look for familiar faces. His eyes came straight to me, measuring, quietly asking a question without words. Does my name work here? I've learned to watch hands. His were in his pockets, thumbs hooked, a small thing, but small things talk. It told me he expected this to be brief, procedural, something to clear before lunch. The kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from repetition, from a lifetime of doors opening without being pushed. The charge itself was plain: illegal parking in a restricted zone near a federal building, a standard citation, no criminal weight. The kind of matter I resolve dozens of times a week. I've seen men tremble over less, and others shrug at far more. This one sat somewhere in between. When he spoke, his voice was calm, practiced. Your Honor, I assume this can be resolved quickly. Not disrespectful, not demanding, just an assumption placed gently on the table. His attorney mirrored that ease, papers already aligned as if the ending were agreed upon in advance. I looked at his face when he stopped talking. That's when I saw it: not defiance, not entitlement, fatigue, the kind that settles behind the eyes after years of being recognized before being understood. This wasn't a man enjoying power. It was a man accustomed to his name doing half the walking for him. And in that moment, before a single fact was examined, I knew the room was about to decide something far bigger than a parking ticket: whether the bench would bend, or whether the rules would quietly stand their ground. I remember thinking, after he sat down, that this case shouldn't have been in my courtroom at all. A simple restricted zone ticket like that usually gets handled before it ever reaches a judge. Pay it, contest it by mail, show proof of authorization, done. But when I looked at the file, I saw the quiet story the paperwork tells if you read it like a diary. 2 continuances, 2 missed appearances, and notes written in that careful clerk's language that tries to stay polite while recording inconvenience. For most people, a second no-show doesn't come with softness. It comes with an added fine, a notice that stops being friendly, sometimes a warrant in more serious matters. The system isn't cruel. It's just built to keep moving, and it moves hardest on the people who can't afford to slow it down. That morning, the courtroom had the usual faces: older men in work jackets, a woman clutching a folder like it was a life raft, a veteran with his cap in his lap. They didn't have assistants. They didn't have someone working on it. They had bus schedules and aching knees and the nervous feeling of being called to a microphone where every word matters. So when I saw a request stamped on the defense side, defense requests expedited handling, I felt the temperature change inside me. Not anger, something quieter, a test, not political, not personal. Just the old pressure between status and procedure, the subtle idea that certain people should be moved to the front because waiting is for everyone else. Hunter's posture shifted as the clerk confirmed the prior dates. The confident ease from the first minute softened into something closer to careful. His jaw tightened when he heard the numbers read aloud, like he'd expected the past to be negotiable. He didn't argue, yet he listened, but his eyes flicked to his attorney for half a second. A reflex that said, "Fix this." I thought of my father then, not as a speech, just a memory that lived in my bones. He used to tell me a courtroom is one of the few places where a man's name should have to sit down like everybody else's. No shortcuts, no special doors, just the same straight line to the truth. I looked at Hunter Biden and I decided something simple. Whatever happened next, it would be ordinary. The kind of ordinary that protects dignity, especially for the people in the back row who never get to ask for anything expedited. And I could see, even before I spoke, that he was starting to understand this wasn't going to disappear on reputation alone, and that understanding can make a man either humble or dangerous. I remember the moment the room stopped breathing. I began the way I always do, with questions so ordinary they barely feel like questions at all. Where was the vehicle parked? Were the posted signs visible? Did he recall the date of the citation? His answers came quickly, cleanly, like stones placed in a straight line. Too clean. Experience teaches you that truth is rarely that neat. When he said, "I wasn't aware of the restriction," his voice stayed steady but his body didn't. He swallowed mid-sentence, just enough to break the rhythm. His eyes slid away from me and fixed on a spot above the clerk's desk. People think judges listen with their ears. Mostly, we listen with our eyes. I asked about the missed appearances. He explained them as misunderstandings, scheduling conflicts, things that happen when life gets complicated. I didn't interrupt. Silence has a way of inviting people to keep talking, and with each sentence, his certainty thinned. The confidence from earlier didn't vanish, it tightened, like a grip held too long. The officer's statement was brief. No edge to it, no interest in who the defendant was, just times, locations, procedure. He confirmed that a verbal warning had been given, that the signage was unobstructed. Facts don't raise their voice, they don't need to. That's when Hunter shifted again. His shoulders rolled back, not in pride, but in defense. He leaned slightly toward the microphone and said, almost casually, "You know who my father is, right?" The words landed before he could catch them. I saw it immediately. His eyes widened a fraction, the regret arriving a second too late. The courtroom went silent in a way you can feel on your skin. No murmurs, no gasps, just stillness. I didn't react right away. I let the moment exist exactly as it was. Because this wasn't about influence, it was about belief. The belief that rules bend when names are spoken aloud. Inside, I felt a familiar weight. Not anger, disappointment, maybe, or recognition. I've seen that look before on men who don't realize they're asking for something they don't actually want. I set my papers aside and looked directly at him. My voice didn't rise when I spoke. If anything, it slowed. "Mr. Biden," I said, "let me explain how this courtroom works." And as I said it, I knew something had cracked. Not the case, but the story he'd been telling himself about how this was supposed to end. I remember how the silence changed after he said his father's name. It wasn't the ordinary courtroom quiet, the kind you get when people are waiting their turn. This was heavier. Even the clerk's pen stopped moving. Papers lay still. I felt it settle in my chest. The clear understanding that whatever came next was no longer about a car or a curb. I knew it then, without drama or anger. This case had crossed a line all on its own. Hunter tried to pull the words back. "I didn't mean it like that," he said quickly, almost too quickly. His voice softened, then shifted again. "I just mean, this kind of thing usually doesn't go this far." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. But expectation has its own volume. It's the sound of someone explaining why the rules should weigh less in his hands than in everyone else's. I didn't interrupt him. I reached up and took off my glasses, slow enough to give the moment room to breathe. When people start justifying exceptions, a judge has a responsibility to stop listening to the explanation and start protecting the room. What I felt wasn't anger. Anger clouds judgment. This was disappointment, the kind that comes when someone has every chance to step back and chooses not to. That's when I noticed the man in the second row, an older veteran waiting on a minor inspection case. He let out a quiet sigh, not aimed at anyone. He didn't look at Hunter. He stared at the floor, like someone who's heard this story before and knows how it usually ends. Hunter felt it too. His words began to tumble over each other. Sentences started and didn't finish. The confidence he walked in with had nowhere left to stand. He leaned forward, then back, searching for solid ground. Then he made the mistake that told me everything. He tried to smile, a small joke, barely formed, offered up as a release valve. In another room, on another day, it might have worked. It didn't land. The silence grew sharper, not hostile, just honest. That's the moment people fear most, when the room refuses to help them escape themselves. I leaned slightly toward the bench microphone and spoke evenly, without edge or heat. "Mr. Biden," I said, "this courtroom doesn't work on expectations." I could see it register, not defiance, not yet, just the first real understanding that there was no lever left to pull. And I thought to myself, quietly, as judges often do in moments like that, now comes the reckoning, or the resistance. I remember how ordinary the evidence looked when it finally came forward. No dramatic reveal, no raised voices. The officer stepped up and handed over the photographs the same way he'd done 100 times before. I took them in my hands and studied them carefully, not hunting for a technicality, not looking for an exit, just looking for the truth as it existed on that street that day. The sign was there, clear, unobstructed. The timestamp sat neatly in the corner of the image, indifferent to who owned the vehicle. The car was exactly where it shouldn't have been, nothing malicious, nothing accidental either. I looked back at Hunter Biden and I understood something quietly, without judgment. He hadn't known everything, but he'd known enough to take the chance, enough to assume the consequences would be negotiable. That assumption, more than the parking violation, was what had carried him into this room. This wasn't a story about bad intent, it was about habit, about living in a world where consequences arrive softened, rounded at the edges, explained away before they ever fully land. He shifted in his seat while I examined the photos. The fight drained out of him, not all at once, but piece by piece. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, lower, stripped of strategy. "I've had enough consequences in my life," he said. He didn't invoke his father. He didn't look to his attorney. For the first time that morning, he didn't sound like a man managing an outcome. He sounded tired, human, a man who had lost things and was afraid of losing more. I held that moment carefully. Judges learn when to press and when to pause. Before I could respond, the veteran in the gallery spoke, barely above a breath. "So have we." It wasn't accusation. It wasn't anger. Just a statement of fact, worn smooth by years, the kind of truth that doesn't ask permission to exist. Hunter went quiet after that, sat back, hands out of his pockets now, resting flat on his knees. He didn't interrupt again. Some lessons arrive not as blows, but as weight. When I issued the ruling, it was plain, the standard fine, an added penalty for the missed appearances, no speeches, no exceptions, exactly what anyone else standing in that spot would have received, nothing more, nothing less. And in that stillness, with no cameras flashing and no headlines waiting, I felt something settle into place, not victory, not satisfaction, but balance. I remember how quietly the room returned to itself once the ruling was spoken. No applause, no reactions worth noticing. Just the soft scrape of a chair, the clerk resuming her notes, the familiar sound of the docket breathing again. Hunter Biden nodded once. Not sharply, not in protest, just a small acknowledgement, like a man accepting weather he can't argue with. He thanked the court briefly, without performance, and stepped back. For the first time that day, he didn't look at me as a calculation. He looked past me, toward the exit, already carrying the weight with him. I watched him walk out the same way I watch everyone walk out, not as a name, not as a symbol, but as a person returning to his life with whatever the courtroom has handed him. Some people leave lighter, others leave quieter. He left quieter. That difference matters. Quiet is where reflection lives, if it lives anywhere at all. The next case was called. The veteran stood, adjusted his jacket, and approached the bench with the careful dignity of someone who doesn't want trouble, only closure. We handled his matter in minutes. When it was done, he didn't rush away. As he passed the bench, he looked up at me and said, "Thank you for not making it special." He didn't smile. He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded and walked out, carrying something steadier than relief. Those words stayed with me longer than the name on the earlier case ever could. Courts aren't remembered for who stands before them. They're remembered for who they stand up for. A few weeks later, after the file had been closed and stacked away with thousands of others, a short envelope arrived chamberside. No letterhead, no legal language, just a few lines written plainly. Hunter Biden wrote that he hadn't expected fairness to feel uncomfortable, not painful, uncomfortable, like standing on ground that doesn't bend when you lean on it. There was no apology in the note, no request, no attempt to explain himself, and I didn't need any of that. Courts aren't built to extract remorse. They exist to establish boundaries and sometimes, if you're fortunate, to remind people where those boundaries actually are. I sat with that letter longer than most, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I've learned over decades on the bench. When justice works, it rarely feels good, it feels honest. And honesty has a way of unsettling people who aren't used to it. I thought about how many times I'd seen anger dissolve into silence, and silence into understanding, when a room refuses to bend for anyone. I thought about my father then, the way I often do when a case lingers longer than it should. He worked hard his whole life and trusted institutions cautiously. He used to say the law only works when it treats everyone as temporary, no one elevated, no one reduced, everyone passing through the same door for the same reasons. That day, no one won. No one lost. The cameras didn't change anything. The name didn't change anything. The court did what it was meant to do, nothing more and nothing less. The law doesn't exist to humble people. It exists to remind us that no name is heavier than the rules we all live under.